Right. Let's now go talk about some of Joe Biden's legislations. Or his failed attempts to pass legislation through the Senate. Of course, remember he dominates. The Democrats dominate the House of Representatives. They've got a wafer-thin majority in the Senate, but of course they can't get much passed in the Senate without breaking the filibuster, the supermajority. And there's a way around it, and that's through reconciliation. And that sometimes allows governments, as long as it's specifically to do with money, it allows administrations to circumvent the normal rules of the Senate. So this is a good example, and it raises a discussion about one particular senator, Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat, and his role in scuppering a lot of the plans of the administration. I mean, the progressives regard. I mean, Bernie Sanders regards Joe Manchin as a conservative, and he really doesn't belong to the Democrats, according to Bernie Sanders. So we'll look at that as we go along. Okay. So Joe Biden tabled a bill, the Build Back Better bill, and it's a bill introduced to fulfill aspects of his promises. Um, it was spun off from an Americans Jobs Plan alongside the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. So it was a way of bringing together a number of policies that Joe Biden had in mind, and he trailed this on the campaign trail when he was seeking to become the Democratic nominee and then the president. So it's a 3.5 trillion package. It's a reconciliation package, and it includes provisions such as climate change and social policy. So it remains it successfully was able to count as a reconciliation package, even though, by the way, they tacked on a number of areas like climate change and social policy, but they stuck very doggedly to budgets and to money rather than to other issues. Now, the first hurdle, I mean, so Joe Biden gave up on a bipartisan approach, so that's why he chose the reconciliation route. The first hurdle was to get it past his progressive wing as well as his more right conservative wing of the party. Remember, the Democrats are a broad church party, like any political party in a first past the post system. They will include, like the Labour Party, like the Conservatives, they'll include different wings. The Democratic wings, I think, are far more pronounced than the Republican Party today. I suspect the Republican Party is pretty unified um, uh, in comparison to the Democrats. Um, Now, there were intense negotiations. The reason why he had to put in climate change to start with is because the progressives, the AOCs and the Ilhan Omars and the Bernie Sanders, required and impressed upon him to deal with climate change through these packages. But it initially could not get past the conservative wing of the party, sort of the more right-leaning conservatives. And so he had to shred it down to 2.2 trillion. They were more concerned with fiscal aspects of the bill. They argued that this would be leaving a legacy for future generations who'd have to pay it all back, right? And so they were far more unhappy with the sort of unlimited nature of the spending. 3.5 trillion is a very large sum. Um, the bill passed in the House of Representatives by the House of Representatives in November, and that's because, of course, the Democrats have a majority. Um, Now, during the negotiations in the Senate, Joe Manchin publicly pulled his support for the bill, um, and he argued that his own figure, he believed the bill should not spend over 1.75 trillion. Now, I think that was just a ruse. He was trying to. He didn't like the bill. For all sorts of reasons, he felt the bill was very problematic, as I said, and so he was not in favour of it. But in subsequent negotiations, there was ill will between the negotiating parties and Manchin, and he then said, "Okay, to hell with this. I'm going to retract my support for the bill, and I'm not going to now seek a compromise." So it effectively killed the bill. As you remember, it needs 50 senators to pass via reconciliation, and there were 50 Republican senators who were dead against the bill. They were never going to win over any Senate Republican senators, and so it was because of him that the bill was lost. The chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, a major backer of the bill, had urged President Biden to enact the green energy and climate change provisions through executive order. He has not done that yet. So, the progressive wing are pretty angry with Joe Manchin and what he did to scupper this bill. And of course, the Republicans are pretty happy with Manchin because they see him as a repeated spoiler. He's the guy who spoils democratic unity, and so we've seen that already over the reverse, over the removal of the supermajority required, the filibuster required in the Senate. So let's say a few words about Manchin as a figure. He's always been a problem. He opposed the energy policies of Barack Obama. He's pro-petrol, pro-oil, and that's because West Virginia is an oil-producing state. He had problems with Barack Obama's intentions to reduce and restrict coal mining, because of course that would harm his constituents. He voted against the closure for the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act, which was an act that was passed by Barack Obama to allow gay LGBTQ people in the army. It was there was a previous rule that basically said as long as you don't reveal your sexuality, you can join the army. Barack Obama felt that was very unequal, and he wanted to reverse that. Right? He voted to remove federal funding for Planned Parenthood in 2015, so he's very much in the anti-abortion camp. Planned Parenthood, of course, is a body to help women, help families make decisions about family planning, and he voted to remove federal funding for that. He supported President Trump's border wall and immigration policies and voted to confirm most of his cabinet and judicial appointments, including Brett Kavanaugh, very controversial appointment, of course, to the Supreme Court. The Democrats were dead against this, but again, Joe Manchin was in favor. So what makes him a Democrat then? Why doesn't he just cross the aisle and join the Republican Party? And that is a good question. That's a question that a lot of the progressives are asking. And that is and I've got here, in fact, he's against a lot of things that the progressives are calling for. Medicare for all, Green New Deal, abolishing the filibuster, expanding the Supreme Court, defunding the police. He's against all of that stuff, right? So what makes him a Democrat? I suppose what makes him a Democrat is that he still believes in some of the fundamental values of the Democrats. He still believes that the state can do good. So you can say that he is if in British politics, you would probably compare him to a third way, maybe not even third way, to a social democrat, but a social democrat that's wary of too much government intervention. I don't know. I mean, you can probably say that he's a right-leaning Labour politician, possibly. But he believes his home is the Democrats, and he believes that on abortion, by the way, he doesn't believe in the extremities of, say, the Arkansas law. He believes that's wrong, right? So and he's not in favor of of removing abortion rights. I mean, that's not where he is. He wants there to be for women's right to choose. So in that sense, he is a Democrat. But he has a very strong belief in the checks and balances that exist within the Constitution, and he doesn't want to undermine that. Um, right. Now, progressives in the party. So let's talk about bipartisanship. Progressives in the Biden administration want him to throw his energy behind issues like climate change and voting rights and immigration and abortion. And where you fail to get the Senate to agree, they're pushing for a rule change such that the filibuster is removed. Failing that, they also want him to take executive action, like on student debt forgiveness. This has been a massive problem in America, especially as a result of the COVID and the recent economic crisis, that student debt is weighing down large numbers of young people, and the progressives want Joe Biden to forgive that student debt, and if the Senate doesn't accept, then to use the instrument of executive orders to do so. Okay. So you've got that wing, and then you've got the moderates in his party who are upset that he promised bipartisanship and then put forward proposals that failed to win over the most conservative members, much less a single Republican. So again, they argue, well, if you're going to reach across the aisle, well, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to be able to win people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to see eye to eye with your proposals. Because if they don't agree with you, then there's no chance you're going to get the Republicans who are further to the right to agree with you. So he's got these tensions within the party. So the problem at the moment looks like that bipartisanship is dead in American politics, right? The ability of an administration to reach out to the opposite side, which, by the way, Biden came to the presidency promising bipartisanship. Remember, he said that he was a guy who was a senator for so many years, and his forte as a senator was to reach out to the opposition. And so, he was the negotiator, the person who would compromise, right? But there's been very little sign of that, at least when it comes to some of his key bills. He's used executive orders to reverse a lot of the Trump presidency executive orders that were signed, for example. But if you look carefully, there have been plenty of signs of bipartisanship. And it's still possible in Washington. So there are some exceptions to this. President Biden recently signed into law a bill reforming the Postal Service, which drew support from both sides of the House, both sides of the Senate, and the House of Representatives. The same happened with a measure that keeps companies and universities from shielding themselves against lawsuits from sexual harassment. Again, both sides agreed, and it was a bipartisan act that was passed. Both houses have passed a package aimed at boosting American competitiveness, again with the support in both parties. So there have been bills that are passed, but the problem, I suppose, or the issue that causes the most polarization are these hot button issues like voting rights or gun control or immigration. And many of these are cultural issues, of course, and abortion. Many of these are cultural issues, or at least have links. People see them as cultural issues, and so as a result of that, polarization ensues, right? So these are examples of bipartisan bills that have been passed, but on the big issues, there is no. And Biden is being blamed by some of the moderates in his party for not sufficiently seeking to gain these bipartisan agreements before tabling a bill through the House of Representatives and then to the Senate. There's another piece of legislation that's really important for you to know about. The Constitution places the organization of elections firmly in the hands of 50 individual states. So there are some rules that are from the federal government for voting. However, most of the way in which elections are administered are all done at a local level. So it's up to the individual states to administer that. Now, here's a comparison with the British system. That leaves it up to the politicians in those states to organise the system. In the UK, we've got a completely separate body, the electoral commission, that does all of that. And there's very little political interference. Although recently, if you remember, there was a bill that was passed that did at least open the door for some level of political interference in Britain. But in the UK, in the US, it is very much a politicized affair. So there are certain national criteria that are mandatory under laws such as the Voting Rights Act 65 and the Help America Vote Act 2002, which was passed by George W. Bush. But in many practical ways, the conduct of elections is left to individual states, right? So individual states are responsible for the conduct of elections. As with other areas of government, this is ultimately down to the Constitution, right? So the Constitution disables the central government to do a lot here. Now, the Republicans had passed at least, or have passed in at least 34, in 19 states, 34 laws over the last year that make it harder to vote, particularly for people of color. So these statewide acts serve to challenge democratic participation. So, for example, the requirement for voter ID, they've increased those people who are not allowed to vote at all. So felons, for example. Many of these laws are designed to hamstring the Democrats and to, in particular, to make it much more difficult for ethnic minority, black voters, Latino voters who largely vote for the Democrats. They're disabling them from voting, or making it much more difficult for them to vote. Now, the Democrats have countered this encroachment of democracy by tabling federal laws. The Freedom to Vote Act looks to create central legislation, right? So there is this legislation that is currently being debated in the two houses. But all 50 Republican senators opposed the bill, and without changing the filibuster again, it's just not going to pass, right? So the Freedom to Vote Act, and by the way, a lot of black Americans feel that Joe Biden has not seriously taken this threat to democracy, or has not taken this threat to democracy very seriously. And they've shown that they've been very vocal about that. They've argued that Biden has been lost in other things and has decided to, because it's so controversial, to not do very much about it. Well, now he is tabling this bill, but they know full well that it's never going to go anywhere because you've got this stalemate, this gridlock, which comes out of the Senate, right? So let me then say something about whether this is more for analysis. As I said, you're not going to get a question on the Imperial Presidency. But it's really good analysis to put into an essay. I remember when I did teach US politics many years back, this was quite nice analysis to put into all sorts of paragraphs and all sorts of essays. Now, the accepted story of the modern American presidency has been one of the expanding executive power. The presidency is expanded. And it was called by Arthur Schlesinger as the Imperial Presidency, if you remember. The historian argued that, in particular during the Nixon era, there was the growth in presidential powers and secrecy, and it came, he called it similar to the elective dictatorship, which is of course a concept that is used in UK. Someone's calling me, my brother's calling me, and I'm going to have to respond to him a bit later. But the imperial presidency idea, right? Now, acquiring and exercising more and more authority at the expense of other branches of government, we've said that. Yet there is a counter view to this. There's a countervailing narrative too, especially in the era of political polarization, obstruction, and congressional gridlock, when passing laws requires a level of political consensus that does not exist in a system where politicians are increasingly incentivized not to make deals but to brag about their refusal to compromise. I've put here some of the reasons why compromise today is really difficult. Um, you know, one of the primary reasons actually in the Republican Party is that Donald Trump now sees it as an affront to himself if any Republican works with the Democrats in a meaningful way. Because, of course, he believes, and large numbers of Americans believe, that the election was stripped away from them. I mean, the 70% of Republican voters believe that the election was rigged. The last election, the 2020 election, was rigged, right? And so, in that atmosphere, it becomes very difficult for bipartisan compromise. And the progressives don't want to compromise. The progressives believe that the Republicans have moved so far right, they don't want any compromise as well. Okay, so on leaving the White House in 2016, on many issues from abortion to gun ownership and milk formula shortages, the Biden presidency can do little but implore and comment. I think this is a good analytical point about the administration. It tends to condemn a lot. It tends to say a lot. It tends to speak a lot. It tends to say that it's going to do something. But apart from that, it doesn't really have the powers. The levers are no longer available to the presidency, in other words. They no longer have those levers to make a change. And I think that is a real worry for the Democrats, right? They can't really do what they promised. On leaving the White House, Barack Obama told the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin that despite the unique power vested in the presidency, he had come to realize it also came with a whole host of institutional constraints that held him back from both doing and saying what he wanted. Barack Obama was a master of this. He said a lot, he promised a lot, but he delivered very little, actually, as a president, right? And when he did deliver, like Obamacare, it just wasn't what the original idea envisaged, what the original idea was about. And so you can say that, is it really an imperial presidency? Or are the institutional constraints now so great, and is gridlock so much of an issue now that it just makes it impossible for presidents to get things done unless they have a supermajority in the Senate? That's really the sticking point. When Biden went to Uvalde, the protesters shouted, "Do something, just do something for God's sake." Yet there's very little that he can do, right? A couple of days ago, it's worth watching. There was a rare interview. By the way, Biden has been also accused of not doing very many interviews, and that's partly because he's not very good at interviews. But he did an interview, and I forget on what channel, but it was a rare interview. And in that, he said that he's going to do something on gun crime. In fact, they have tabled a piece of legislation, but it's never going to get through, right? So a lot of what they end up doing is just to assure the base that they're trying, rather than So as I said here, Democrats in the House will try and fail to pass Biden's assault weapons ban, and by doing that, they can send a signal out to voters that they're doing their best. All Biden can do on abortion, by the way, is he said in that interview that Americans need to elect more pro-abortion senators to the Senate in order to overturn things. Well, that's going to take a long time, right? To be able to change the parliamentary arithmetic, as we call it in the UK, that's a longer process, and Biden is probably not going to see the fruits of that. And so my analysis here is that we've got the opposite to the imperial presidency. It no longer sounds like a presidency that overreaches. Rather, the presidency has very few levers to do things. I mean, the baby milk crisis was an example of this. But Biden was caught short. Executive orders. In his first 100 days in office, Biden signed more than 60 executive orders executive actions, 24 of which are direct reversals of Trump's policies. So this included halting funding for the construction of Trump's border wall, reversing Trump's travel ban against largely Muslim-majority countries, imposing a mask mandate on federal property, ramping up vaccination supplies, cancelling the Keystone XL pipeline, which is the Canada-America pipeline, which Barack Obama cancelled and Donald Trump started back up again, and then Biden cancelled once again, ending federal use of private prisons, and reversing Trump's ban on transgender Americans joining the military. All of this was done with, and more was done within his first 100 days. Now, Biden was accused then of overusing executive orders, right? And he said, "I'm not making new law. I'm eliminating bad policies." So his executive orders were not. He was very sensitive about being accused of using executive orders to pass laws. His argument is, "I'm just eliminating bad policy." He signed more executive orders in his first 100 days than Trump did, who was accused of abusing these powers. Right, so Trump was accused of abusing executive orders. In fact, some of his executive orders, like the border wall and these things, were seen to be an abuse of civil liberties, even. But Biden is very wary of that. Now, when he was asked in that interview I talked about, why don't you introduce an executive order to eliminate or to deal with gun control? He said, "I don't want to emulate Trump's abuse of the Constitution." So he doesn't want to go there. And I think partly the reason why he doesn't want to go there is because he knows that would be challenged by the Supreme Court. And he knows that probably the Supreme Court, in its originalist interpretation, is probably going to overturn that executive order. So, he's very wary of that. What I'm painting a picture of a presidency that has very few levers. Now he is considering issuing an executive order if the Supreme Court does overturn Roe, and again that would be subject to a challenge in the Supreme Court. But that is something that he's thinking about if the Alito judgment becomes reality. And as I said, this will certainly be challenged by the Supreme Court. Right. Okay, so let's talk about the foreign policy. Is not going to be in your course, but I think it's worth just saying a few words about foreign policy because it helps understand some of Joe Biden's actions. Right? I'm going to go through this quite quickly. Afghanistan's withdrawal was a turning point for Biden. This is when his popularity plummeted. He had, by the way, like Trump, promised to end the disastrous war in Afghanistan after 20 years. It's America's longest war. Trump had negotiated a deal with the Taliban, and Biden followed through on this by setting a deadline for withdrawal. However, the US-backed government in Afghanistan collapsed, and the Taliban walked straight into power. If you remember, the Taliban just walked into power. They took over the capital, Kabul, within days. The Biden presidency believed that they had done enough with the Ghani government. The Ghani government was his proxy was the American proxy in Afghanistan. They thought that the Ghani government will put up a fight, like Ukraine did, Zelensky did in Ukraine, right? But the Ghani government was straight out of the country. I mean, as soon as the Americans left, Ghani was on a plane with many millions of dollars, escaping the wrath of the Taliban. So Taliban won the conflict, and in reality, America lost its longest war in Afghanistan. And as a quick side point, that's why American policy now is basically to starve the country to death. It's put in horrendous sanctions on Afghanistan, and people are in famine in the country. This is Biden, who talks a lot about human rights abuses. Well, he's very much turned a blind eye to what's happening at the moment to the ordinary people in Afghanistan. He's punishing, in other words, ordinary people in Afghanistan for losing the conflict, right? For the Taliban winning. Biden was critical of the Afghan war, even under the Obama presidency, and Obama didn't have the guts, in a way, to pull out the troops. because Obama felt that if he pulled out troops from Afghanistan, he would be accused as being weak on terrorism. And Obama always had this problem of trying not to look weak on foreign policy. So Obama intensified the conflict. He sent more troops to Afghanistan, and that just all failed. Right, the policy was disastrous. I mean, as a quick side point, Obama's presidency, especially when it comes to foreign policy, was a massive failure. And I think Joe Biden recognizes that. Even Democrats today recognize that Obama just had his foreign policy did very little meaningful. Biden, however, has recovered due to his Ukraine policy, and this is where I'm going here. Biden did very well over Ukraine, and he rallied European support against Russia. He levied all sorts of sanctions to isolate Russia. The problem is the Biden presidency has not gained from this at home. In many ways, foreign policy is a reserve of a president failing at home. Usually, when a president fails at home, they do things internationally, which brings them high poll ratings, right? However, this hasn't happened for the Biden presidency. So you can compare this with, for example, previous presidencies. You can compare it with the Bush presidency. When you win wars and when you fight conflicts abroad, that normally incites patriotic feelings at home, and you're able to then reverse some of the domestic failures by showing that you've successfully been a foreign policy. You've successfully used your foreign policy role successfully. I've said that in a strange way. But his failures at home have not been masked by foreign policy. In fact, his poll ratings slunk after the Afghanistan invasion and have remained where they are, really, despite Ukraine. So Ukraine isn't really helping him at all at home. Okay. Lastly, two more slides. So I'm going to say a few words about the New York versus Supreme Court. So New York gun laws got stronger. People under 21 will be prohibited from buying semi-automatic weapons under a series of measures. Body armor sales will be banned. Bullets will be microstamped, so it's easier to trace. The red flag law will be expanded to allow more people to file orders seeking to get guns confiscated from people who may pose a danger. For example, if a parent says, "My son is unstable," then in New York, those guns can be taken away from them. By the way, believe it or not, in Texas, a parent cannot get a law enforcement individual to take the gun away from their son if they think that their son is unstable. That's just not permitted. That's how liberal those laws are in some states, right? However, any day now, the Supreme Court is expected to hand down a ruling that could remove laws strictly limiting the public carrying of firearms. So the New York administration, the New York politicians, they wanted to, they've passed a law to limit the public carrying of firearms. So you're not allowed to take your firearms effectively outside of your home, right? In New York, state law requires people to apply for a permit to carry a concealed gun and to show proper cause or a special need to carry a gun outside their home that goes beyond a generalized social danger or fear. So you can't carry a gun around because you fear crime, for example, or fear muggings. You've got to prove that there is a lawful reason to carry a gun. The Supreme Court recognized the Second Amendment as an individual right in the 2008 judgment, the District of Columbia versus Heller. But the ruling was limited in protecting the right to keep a gun in defense of health and home. That should say health and home, right? So there was a ruling that said that it's an individual right back in 2008. So that strengthened the Second Amendment, but it limited itself to keeping a gun in defense of health and home. In the case before it now, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the justices are weighing whether denying an application for a concealed carry license for self-defense outside the home and in public violates the Second Amendment. In other words, this case that is currently going through the Supreme Court between this Rifle Association and the Justice Department in New York is looking at whether the Second Amendment prevents the state authorities from removing from disallowing people carrying weaponry in the public, right? And it's likely, by the way, that it's going to be overturned, right? So, in other words, that New York law will no longer be applicable. So people then can carry weaponry outside of their homes. That's one to look out for. I mean, I don't think the judgment will come before your exam, but you can talk about that. Let's say a few words now about the Republican Party. And there's a lot more to go, sorry. In fact, I'm going to stop there. And because it's been a long video, and I'm going to then upload this and then just record the last section of this.